Welcome back to everybody. This is the final leg of the 3-session of the CEPR Research and Policy Network on climate and on sustainable finance. And in the last session, we did the supply chain. And the main message, if you remember, was we have to do it at product level, so really micro. And now we are turning completely the other way. We forget about the intermediate companies. We go to the macro level, stress testing the whole system. But as you will see, we will need the company data to get there. But what is happening now increasingly, we have learned the stress testing after the financial crisis. That's now turned into other stress tests, climate stress tests. Horizon will be completely different because that's a long-term issue, longer term than the normal stress tests. We will talk a lot about data, and this is now a big thing for banks, for central banks, and we have an international audience. I think it is fair to say that Europe is ahead. Then second comes Asia with China, and I'm afraid to say that the US is coming third, because we had a big panel of the BIS earlier this year, and then with the governors it became quite clear. My own expectation is that at some point the US will also come in. But today we are at the forefront in Europe. We are very lucky with both the Société Générale and with Banque de France, who are leaders in this field. And I would like to open the floor to Michala Marcussen from Société Générale to start what your experiences are and what are the good things and what are the bottlenecks. The floor is yours.
So thank you very much, Dirk, and thank you for inviting me here today. I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to share some thoughts about what makes climate stress tests different on the ground in a bank. And what I thought I would do is just run through a few slides for you and share some ideas. But before we get into climate stress tests, I think it's always just useful to remind ourselves of what some of the good principles around stress testing are. And just here on my first slide, I've listed up, on the next page, I've listed up the stress testing principles. So this is the latest version that I found, which is from October 2018. It's done by the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. And I think when you read through this list, they all seem very obvious. Stress testing frameworks should have clearly articulated and formally adopted objectives. They have to have a strong, effective governance structure. They should be used as a risk management tool and to inform business decisions. Now, I think this is particularly important because when we think about climate change and we think about various policy instruments, I think we have to be careful to think about the right policy instrument for the right goal. And so I just emphasize this because sometimes when I listen to various debates about climate stress tests, I have a feeling that the expectations on the policy goals that the stress tests are supposed to achieve sometimes span perhaps a little bit too wide on the ambitions. And so, one of my key messages is also that, if we want to achieve our climate goals, it would be a huge mistake to rely on stress testing alone. But of course, it has a role to play. Then, of course, the fourth principle is that the framework should capture material and relevant risks and apply stresses that are sufficiently severe. And I'll come back to some observations around this. But here we see some of the challenges already arriving with the climate stress tests. Then, of course, we need the resources and the organizational structures. And you'll see these are quite complex exercises, so very demanding. And then this is where we get to the interesting part. Stress tests should be supported by accurate and sufficiently granular data. And this is perhaps with robust IT systems where some of the big challenges are today. And of course, we need to recognize that climate stress tests are still under construction. Models and methodologies to assess the impacts of the scenarios and sensitivities should be fit for purpose. The stress testing models, the results and the frameworks should be subject to challenge and regular review, which is indeed what we're preparing for here in Europe. And then finally, the stress testing practices and findings should be communicated within and across jurisdictions. And I think already at this stage, I take the opportunity to congratulate a number of networks. So of course, we have the network for the greening of the financial system, where Banque de France is one of the leaders. But we also have other initiatives, UNEP-FI that have done a number of work, and I could mention many other organizations. But I also want to mention the importance of forums just like this one, where we can share thoughts and share ideas, and indeed build towards, I would say, a consensus on what climate stress tests should be and how they should be achieved. Now, just on the next slide, I wanted to highlight some of the differences between our typical stress tests that we run, and I'll give you some more examples later on, and then the climate stress test. And the first one, Dirk already mentioned this, which is very important, is the horizon. Most of the typical stress tests, for example, if we take the EBA stress test or even the Fed stress tests, these typically are looking at a horizon of around 3 years. But when it comes to the climate stress tests, we can, of course, look at short-term horizons, and we'll see later on that the upcoming exercise from the ECB also includes short-term horizons, but we're often looking at very long-term horizons. We can be, as far out as 30 years out, so it's quite a difference. And I'll come back to why in a moment, but this is a very important point. The second one, which is really challenging, and this is a challenge to me as an economist in particular, is, but also to many of my colleagues who also work on these exercises, is that we have very little historical data. Usually if we're trying, let's say we're trying to model a stress on a financial crisis, well, unfortunately, we have quite a few episodes to choose from, and we can model damages and we can establish benchmark and references. But, perhaps it's good news, but we don't have very much in terms of climate-related stress on the history side. So it becomes, we have to think about a framework that we can use to compensate for this point. And then, of course, it's highly complex. It involves modeling at many different levels. We need a climate scenario, so a kind of physical climate scenario. And here I'm thinking both of emissions data, temperature curves, all of these things. We need to think about energy systems. We need the macroeconomic scenarios. We need the sector scenarios. And then we also need to go into the granularity of individual companies. And this is perhaps where the climate stress tests are also very different from other stress tests. It's on the very detailed level of granularity that we go into. We do go granular on other stress tests, but usually not in such a system-wide manner. And then the final point, which links back into the horizon, is the critical challenge of the bank balance sheet assumptions. If we're thinking about a 30-year horizon, keep in mind that most credit risk exposures that a bank would have would not run for that long. It may be true just when a mortgage is originated that it would have a 30-year horizon or some long-term infrastructure projects, but most corporate loans have much, much shorter maturities than this. And that means that we are typically, when we're working on the longer horizons, working with what we call a dynamic balance sheet approach. And that means that we need to make assumptions on how the bank's balance sheet will evolve. What type of sectors will the bank be lending to in the future? These are very complex exercises. Now, I separated out these differences from what I actually consider challenges, and I've listed some of these on the next slide. And I think while the differences to me are sort of permanent, the challenges, to my mind, are issues that we will get better at. The ECB itself is called the latest climate stress test that's being conducted, a learning exercise, and we've already had a few learning exercises here in Europe. And I think many of these issues will be resolved as more and more companies start to report data and we get through these learning exercises. So there's complexity in the scenario design to capture multiple risks. This will remain true, but I think it's something we'll get better at over time. And indeed, if we think of normal stress tests, we could also think about having stress tests to try and capture different ideas, a pandemic, an inflation shock. You can list a number of different shocks. We have a big problem with data. I'll come back to that. The modeling techniques, very early stage. We are slowly beginning to see a kind of consensus emerge. And one point I want to emphasize here is it's very important to think about not having, because, we could run stress tests very simply. All the banks could just give the data to the central bank, and then the central bank could do all the work. The ECB already did such an exercise. They released the results a few months ago. But the point is that by having each bank develop its own techniques, its own approaches, it actually gives a robustness to the framework. So the central bank can then look to see how different frameworks are run, because at the end of the day, those frameworks are also very important in informing the business decisions. So again, coming back to the purpose of stress tests, it's to understand the risk on the bank balance sheets, but it's also to inform business decisions. And this is why the ECB is strongly encouraging the banks to develop their own in-house frameworks, which the large European banks are all doing. Then, of course, like the modeling techniques, assumption setting, bank balance sheets, all of these things, not all assumptions are given by the ECB upstream. So a lot of assumption setting still needs to be done. And then, of course, we have the challenge that for disclosure, the methodology needs to be repeatable and consistent. So this is work in progress as well. It is an exercise with very high costs. And I was just mentioning this to Dirk as well, that what we also have to be aware of is it's not just a high cost for the institutions going through the stress test. The whole question of climate reporting, which links into the stress test, comes at a high cost for individual corporates. So a large corporate may be able to support the teams to set out to calculate scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And some people even talk about scope 4 now. But for a small, an SME, it can be very challenging to carry these costs. Now, as Dirk and I were just talking about before we came live here, on the accounting side, we've come up with solutions for that. But it's critical to my mind that we come up with solutions for the SMEs, because otherwise we risk to have a green divide. Because remember, there's the climate stress test on the bank side, but there's also every single large company, or many of the large companies, I should say, are today thinking about climate strategies, adopting their own targets. And if you're trying to align to your own targets, it's very hard to have someone in your perimeter who's not reporting themselves. It's much easier to use suppliers that themselves do reporting. So we could end up squeezing out the SMEs if we're not careful on this point. And then just the final thing that I list here, and it's a problem in all policy instruments on the climate side, and that is there is a risk of carbon leakage as well on the stress tests. So the stress tests are still a learning exercise. And this today is still mirrored in the follow-up consequences from the results. So for now, the stress tests are not triggering new capital requirements. And I would question whether they should trigger new capital requirements at the absolute level, or whether they should more trigger relative shifts in capital requirements. So perhaps some banks would get higher requirements, but some would get lower requirements. But I would urge that we are careful once we get to that stage, not to tighten overall credit conditions, but of course to have it reflected on a relative basis, which is a different point. And then also the results right now are still informing other exercises such as supervisory reviews. So the stress test results actually do matter for the banks. It's just at this stage they don't have capital requirement implications. So just jumping ahead on the next slide. I'll run through these slides a little bit quickly, and Gilbert will talk more about the scenarios. But when I first started working on climate change, I found it really helpful just to have a simple scenario to understand that you have policies and behaviors, and you have a population, you have GDP per capita, you have energy intensity, and then you have emissions per energy unit. So it's a famous Kaya equation. This gives me greenhouse gases. They flow into the atmosphere. That gives me a temperature increase, and that has consequences on weather systems, sea level rises, agricultural productivity, migration, and that gives me economic damages. And of course, all of those policy and behaviors have implications for GDP. So it just, I think it helps us always just to have a start with this simple framework. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that this is taken from the NGFS scenario framework. We tend to have a number of different scenarios. You probably talked about this already, so I won't run through this too much. But what's interesting just to notice is that the transition risks and the physical risks, they tend to correlate inversely, although you can have scenarios where you end up having relatively high physical and transition risks, especially in some of the delayed and disorderly transitions. So they appear on different time horizons, but they both end up being quite high. But what's worth note is that the NGFS has really become a standard in thinking about scenarios, and it informs a lot of the stress tests today, and that will be true also for the upcoming ECB stress test. Just on the next slide. I just wanted to highlight to you that when we go from climate risk to financial risks, I'll just focus on the final column on this chart. So we're talking about credit risks, we're talking about market risks, and these are the focus of the ECB stress test this time round. But we could also be thinking about liquidity, operational, and reputational, just to keep those points in mind. On the next slide, you can just see a quick idea of all the places in which, or some of the places at least, in which we see climate change fitting into the traditional macro models. We have a macro model today where we are using many of the climate variables, also beginning to use it in our regular forecasting exercises. But I just think it's worth having this picture in mind of how much it impacts all of the macro variables across the board. But if we think about the climate scenarios, going on to the next slide, we are very much thinking about the corporate level as well, and it'll become clear to you why. So once we have a climate scenario, we have a macro impact, we need to get to the firm level. And here we're talking about how both the transitions and the physical risks will impact the revenues, the operating costs, investment debt, potentially impair assets as well, and the physical. Even the transition could have implications for asset valuations. And then we end up with our return on assets, our leverage, classical variables. And then through some kind of perhaps a Merton approach, we can take these to probabilities of default and loss given default. But there are a lot of challenges along the way. You know, just something very simple, like the ECB gives us value added at the national level for each sector, which is fantastic. I'm very happy to have the data. But remember, you know, just taking the car producers that are included in French value added will not be the same car producers that are listed on the equity indices. Just taking one of the French car producers, I won't take one because then I won't be doing any favoritism, but we'll take an ex-French car producer. They will perhaps have production sites in the Czech Republic and Spain and China, you know, across the world, and have suppliers from across the world. So their value added is spread across the world. And that means that we have a challenge, because typically when we're working on companies, we're working on global companies. And so we need to think about ways we can link in value added. Now, of course, the further down we go into sectors that are less connected to the global cycle, but more local, of course, then you start to get closer to the national value added. Think about something like the emission data as well. First of all, the scope 1, 2, and 3 data do not add up globally to national emissions. And we have the same problem that our company that's reporting emissions is going to be making these emissions across the globe again, whereas we may be looking at national emission paths. So just another point to keep in mind. And then likewise with the energy system, often we have the data for the national systems, but they may be very different from what applies at the firm level. And then finally, when we're talking about location of assets for physical risks, many people are working on techniques to do this, but just try and think about the complexity of capturing the physical risk in a complex global supply chain. If anyone is in doubt as to the complexity of supply chains, just compare the supplier delivery times in different supply chains, and you'll see that US and Europe, from the PMI survey, US and Europe stand out as having incredibly complex supply chains. So let me give you a few examples just to give you a bit of a feel for some of the data. Moving on to the next slide. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to make a quick point here on the balance sheet of the banks, just on the challenges. So if you just go over to the next slide here, this is just some of the things that we need to think about on a dynamic balance sheet. How are we rolling over current exposures? What are we assuming in terms of the bank's own climate alignment, so divestment? What are we assuming in terms of how the clients are going to align? Because we need to make assumptions on whether the clients are aligning to climate targets. Remember, many companies have those targets. And then we may also be thinking about whether we should have some technology assumptions built in for various clients. Are we going to assume that clients have access to carbon capture and storage, for example? So there are many assumptions. And if you move on to the next slide, we can just start by looking at some of those challenges. Now, I quite like comparing climate stress tests with normal stress tests. So here you can just see, I've taken France, random country I chose. You can see here France, GDP level, 2019 is at 100. 2020, we know it's a pandemic. And then if we look at the EBA 2021 stress test, well, we have the baseline where we have the nice sort of V-shaped recovery you can see here. And then we have the adverse scenario where GDP levels stay low for a long period of time. But this is only a 3-year horizon. Now look at the stress test that we had on climate from the ACPR on the GDP data. Honestly, the difference between the 3 scenarios out to 2030 is barely visible. And then we have to go out all the way to 2050, but the gap that we see on the GDP level is not even close to what we get on the EBA baseline. Now, of course, accumulated over time, you are seeing losses, but it just gives you a sense of how little a shock we're actually seeing at the national GDP level relative to other stress tests. But if we go on to the next slide, look at what happens at the sector level. So here, again, I purposefully selected the manufacture of coke and refined petroleum products to show you, but you can appreciate that when we're looking at individual sectors compared to and again, these are from the ACPR exercise, what you can see here is you can really see the difference at the sector level shock, and it's very significant. So, but look at the horizon again, out to 2025, barely visible, and going further out, it becomes more visible. So we really need to think about how we apply this. And if you think of a loan portfolio, perhaps the average duration of the loan portfolio is 5 years, the loans will be expired before we even get into the stressed horizon. So you can appreciate how those assumptions on balance sheets become very critical and important. Let's go to the next slide to see a few more examples. Here, I just wanted to show you a little bit on the data. So we use the data stream indices, and we just counted the number of companies reporting some kind of scope data. And you can just take the Eurozone. 37% report scope 1 and 2, only 27% report scope 3. So you can see that there are tremendous data gaps. Now, there are providers that fill those gaps, but when we look at the gaps and how they are filled, I'm not criticizing any of the providers for doing so, because they're doing something that's very difficult, but it's not surprising that you get different results from different providers and with different levels of certainties. I've seen one provider that does data with a confidence interval. And if you want to have a confidence interval of 99% relative to what the company itself is reporting, your numbers may be doubled. So it just gives you a little bit of a sense of what's going on. And the other thing you can see is that the reporting varies greatly by sectors. It's not surprising that some of the more energy intensive sectors have gotten ahead of reporting. And what you can see on the next slide here we've done a table where we're looking at the share of total assets that are reporting. And you can see, for example, in the basic materials sector, it's 90% of the assets that are reporting in the euro area. You can see it's lower in the US. So this comes back to Dirk's point that Europe is probably a bit further ahead. But again, you see the tremendous dispersion. So what it really means is that few companies are reporting, but the big polluters, the biggest companies are reporting today. And that probably mirrors as well what we were talking about earlier in the cost that you have to support to actually report all these data. If we go to the next slide, I also just wanted to show you, it's a little, yeah.
2 minutes left.
Yeah, I'm rushing ahead, sorry.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make this final point just on the dispersion of the data. And you can see just within sectors, it's very, very different. Now, I'll skip over the next 2 slides in the interest of time. They're just summarizing about the ECB stress test. But I wanted to highlight one point to you, which is quite interesting. When you read the details from the ECB stress test, which is now on their webpage, one point they make is they would like you to think about green industry risks as well. So in projecting the balance sheets and thinking about everything, we need to try and think about green industry risks. So credibility of alignment policies, uncertain technology, risk of overfunding. It's a very crowded market. And we saw recently the BIS did a paper on green asset bubbles. So just to keep that in mind. I'll move on then to my final slide and conclude, and then hopefully respect my timing. So I've come up with what I've called my 7 C's of what makes climate stress tests different. So common purpose and should respect the same principles. So perhaps I only have 6 C's of differences actually, now that I'm reading my own title again. Coverage and consistency of data is a big challenge. Consensus is still emerging on methods and modeling techniques. The costs must be considered. Crowding on green industries. I mentioned carbon risk leakages. And I also talked about the competitiveness. So I talked about the issues potentially for SMEs, also for the large companies. And of course, the big challenge, which I should have put here on my slide, I apologize, are really some of those differences I mentioned, and especially on the horizon and the lack of historical episodes. And I will stop my comments here.
Thanks a lot for drawing out the issues, including the data issues. And now the floor is over to Gilbert from the central bank perspective.
So thanks a lot, Michala, for your presentation, your nice presentation. And thanks, Dirk, to allow me to present this work at this conference, this work from Claire Alestra, Valérie Chouard, Rémi Leca, and myself. In fact, you know, what I'm going to present here, it's main elements of a tool which can be used to simulate climate policies on a very long horizon at the world level. So it's a very simple tool, as you will see. And on the first page of this presentation, you can get the link. No, it was a slide before. Thanks, Petra. The link to a detailed presentation in working paper of the Banque de France, a detailed presentation of this tool. I have to update it as we have improved this tool, and the link to get this tool, because it's in free access. So I will be very happy if you use it and if you send me some remarks. So what is this tool? It is detailed on the second slide. And on this slide, you know, we present it as a global level projection tool. We distinguish 30 countries or regions, and we show the results of the simulation for each country or region, and of course, at the global world level. So we focus on the impact of climate change and of climate policies on GDP, on the GDP level and growth. And it's this tool, it's a supply side tool. And the horizon of the simulation are twofold, the 2060 first and the end of the century. And in this tool, we distinguish 5 types of energies. 4 correspond to dirty energies, coal, oil, natural gas, dirty electricity. And the last one, clean electricity, is the only one, of course, without any gas emission. In this tool, there is a full calibration of a lot of parameters with values by default coming from the literature, of course, but the user can change all the parameters and can choose himself, the parameters he finds more reasonable. So this tool belongs to the family of the models, for example, built by Nordos, but in a, of course, in a more simple scale, of course. So if we go now to the slide 5, yeah, on this slide, we show the very simple logic of this tool. Hypotheses to use the tool are on the left. The use of the tool has to put in this tool, to introduce in this tool, hypotheses corresponding to the relative price of each type of energy for each country over the 2 sub-period from now to 2060 and from 2060 to the end of the century. And relative price of each type of energy relative to GDP price. The user can also change the hypothesis given by default concerning the relative price of the investment. And behind this, of course, there is a technical progress hypothesis. And this for each country, the evolution of the education level in each country, number of hours worked in average by each worker, the employment rate, and also here the cross between EPL and PMR. It is regulation on labor market, employment protection legislation, and regulation on the product market regulation. So, of course, you can introduce also structural reforms in each country. And from that, you get all results through, of course, some equations and some calibration. You get everything. It means consumption of each type of energy. And behind this, there is substitution elasticity between every couple of energy types. You get the emissions, you get the stock of gas, and from that, the increase of the temperature in average in the world, and from that, the damages from climate change for each country and the net GDP net of damages. But what is also calculated through this model is the negative impact on GDP of climate policies. Climate policies are distortive, of course, and from them you get a negative impact on GDP, but you get also a positive impact through, of course, a lower level corresponding to a lower level of climate damages. So the following slide presents the main hypotheses you have to introduce in this tool, and I don't indicate here all the parameters you can change because it will be too long. And on the right side, you get the results, the output of the simulation, GDP, of course, energy consumption, gas emission, temperature change, and damages from global warming and from the implementation of climate policies. So I'm not going to present all the relations, all the equations of the tool. I'm only going to present the main hypothesis behind this model. And in the following slide, there is what concerns the production function, we assume a Cobb-Douglas production function, Cobb-Douglas, geometric average between capital and labor here, and we endogeneize the growth of the capital, assuming on this long horizons a stability of the ratio of the capital in value divided by the GDP in value, which means that the growth of the volume of capital is equal to the growth of the price of GDP minus the growth of the price of investment, plus, of course, the growth of GDP. So that's the main hypothesis concerning production function. In the following slide, what I present is how we evaluate the TFP. The level of TFP here in log depends on the relative price of energy relative to the GDP price with a negative coefficient that we have estimated, the relative price of investment, which correspond to technical progress, the education level, the employment rate, of course, with decreasing return to the employment rate, and some country fixed effect. I will come back to this after, and some productivity breaks specific in some countries. And the country fixed effects here, it's the relation tree, are explained by the level of regulation on labor and product market, and specific, of course, country fixed effect. On the following slide, I present, of course, the calculation of the average price of energy depending on the relative price of each of the 5 types of energy. And in the relation 5, we evaluate the global, at the level of each country, the consumption of energy depending on the GDP level and depending on the price of energy. And we decompose from this level of energy consumption, the consumption in each type of energy as through, of course, the hypothesis concerning the substitution elasticities of the different types between every couples of different types of energy. If we just could come back to the slide 8, perhaps, the TFP relation at the top, there is a negative impact of the increase of the relative price of energy, negative impact on TFP. It means that the implementation of climate policy increasing, for instance, the carbon tax and the price of gas-emitting energy has a negative impact on GDP through this negative impact on TFP. This is very important to understand the results that I will present after. So from relations I've already presented, if we go to slide 10 now, of course, the emissions of gas will depend on the consumption in all countries at the global level, consumption of different types of energy, and relation below correspond to the stock of gas in the atmosphere, which is related to the previous stock of gas, plus, of course, a part of emissions, and minus here rotary, which correspond to the sequestration of some gas. And from this stock, on the following slide, we get the impact on temperature so the calculate the increase in temperature, and through the relation 9, we get the damages on GDP from climate change. And it's the only one non-linear relation here. You know, there is a non-linear impact of the change of temperature on the damages from climate change. So all the coefficients of these relations are, of course, taken for their values by default are taken from the literature, but the user can change all of them for each country, and there is a large freedom to put what the user finds more reasonable and more acceptable for these parameters. And after, you know, when we have calculated this damages, GDP damages from climate change, we decompose, we split these global damages in damages for each country using for that coefficients coming from OECD studies about that. So that's you know, it's a very simple logic of this tool, but of course it's built at the level of 30 regions or countries, which makes behind that a lot of relations, a lot of equations. So now let's go to the slide 12, excuse me, 12. We propose in the presentation of this tool some basic scenario, but of course the user can build its own scenario. So first there is a business as usual scenario, which corresponds with parameters given by default to the hypothesis of a nil evolution of the relative price of each type of energy, which means that the price of each type of energy changes as the GDP price. That's the first scenario, the business as usual one. And after we evaluate different types of energy, one corresponds to a decrease of the relative price of the clean type of energy. And I will present here perhaps only the last scenario, which is a very ambitious scenario, high carbon taxation scenario, corresponding to an increase by 3% each year all over the world and in all countries of the relative price of the 4 dirty types of energy. 3% per year from 2017 to the end of the century. It makes, you know, it means that you multiply by 11.6 the starting point, the starting level of the relative price of these dirty types of energy. And now just to explain how we evaluate the impact, it is the slide 13. So in the business as usual scenario, we have, of course, climate damages on GDP. And in all other scenarios, we have the climate damages on GDP of the business as usual scenario, but minus the avoided climate damage from climate policies, but plus, in the same time, losses from climate policy. So of course, these scenarios will be better than the business as usual one, only when avoided climate damage will be bigger than losses from climate policies. So on the slide 14, are presented the emissions of gas in each of the scenarios. But I go directly to the following slide, the slide 15, which gives the evaluation of the impact on the temperature at the global level of each of these scenarios. And as you can see, the business as usual scenario is really frightening, because the increase of the temperature is not 2, 3, 4 degrees, but it's 5.5 degrees increase. But it's not extreme. When you look at the literature, a business as usual scenario is really frightening in all research trying to evaluate the impact of temperature. And you see that we reach the goal of 2 degrees only in the high carbon taxation scenario. More exactly, we are at 2.2 degrees at the end of the current century. And to be at 2 degrees, we should add to this at least a slight decrease of the price of the clean type of energy. So it's really frightening. And on the following slide, slide 16, you get the impact on GDP. So at the world level, with a very optimistic, of course, hypothesis that there is no tipping point, there is not, very large damage from tipping points. We lose at the end of the century from climate damages 12 to 13% of GDP. But we'll see that this evaluation is, of course, very contrasted among the different countries. And if you look now at the extreme right of this slide, the impact of the high carbon tax scenario, you get in blue the business as usual damages, in green the avoided damages from the climate policy, but in yellow, you get the losses from the implementation of climate policies. And what you can see is that at the horizon of 2060, we lose GDP from the fact that losses from climate policies are bigger than avoided damages from these policies. And we start to win at a longer horizon, and at the end of the century, of course, we win damages. If you compare the bars corresponding to the end of the century for the business as usual scenario and for the high carbon tax scenario, you see that the net impact is, of course, better for the high carbon tax scenario because the avoided damages are bigger than losses from climate policy. So this illustrates completely the tragedy of the horizon, which means that you start to lose. You start to lose when you implement climate policies, and you win in a very long term, very long horizon. And
are
if
you
we look
finishing,
now,
Gilbert?
yeah, only too much slides and it's finished.
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
And the following slide gives you the impact, of the business as usual scenario at the country or region level. And as you can see, this impact is really contrasted among countries or regions. And for instance, if you take the case of France, you can see that these damages are not so big. But if you consider a country as India or as Africa, an area as Africa or a country as China, damages are very large. And even if you look at some countries as Canada and Russia, the damages are negative. It means that the impact is positive as, of course, the temperature makes large territory able to be used for economic activities in these two countries. And same, you know, it's slide 18. Same at the, if you look at the impact of high carbon tax scenario, compare to the business as usual scenario, you see that of course some countries have a large interest to see an implementation of ambitious climate policies, but others not so much. And this illustrates, you know, very well the tragedy of coordination or the tragedy of free riding, as you want. So the last slide of this presentation is an abstract of what I've said, so I'm not going to present it longer. And of course, we, the authors, we will be very happy if you try to use this free access tool and model and send us your remarks on it. Thanks a lot.
So thanks a lot, Gilbert and Michala, for joining this panel. And thanks a lot to Petra from CEPR for hosting us. And thanks to my colleague, Christian Collier. We did it together. Hi, Christian. I don't know whether you have a final word to say, but I think these 2 days were really excellent in new insights.
Yes, just one word. I mean, we all agree that climate change is there. We still do not completely agree on how to organize society to make it not happening in the future. And these 3 sessions have been very useful to explore those issues of how to organize society and what are things are at stake here. Thank you very much, Dirk. And thank you to
Christian,
all the panelists. That was very exciting.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot. And at least the people in the panel and in the audience are not a blocking for the future.